Hello everyone, my name is Valentin Schmid and I have the pleasure of welcoming here today Saifedean Ammous, a leading economist in the Bitcoin world. He's going to bring out his new book in December. It's called The Bitcoin Standard in relation to the gold standard. And Saifedean's biggest strength, in my opinion, is being able to explain how Bitcoin is sound money and how Bitcoin can actually bring us back to a world similar to the gold standard. Sound money, predictability, high time preference, prosperity for all. How will we get there?
So the main idea in my book is that the real importance of Bitcoin is not that it is a way of making cheap, easy payments. It's not a way of making fast payments. It's not, the strength of it is not that it is a payment network, and it's not that it is going to allow for microtransactions or all these other use cases that we've heard are important for Bitcoin. In my opinion, the most important thing that Bitcoin offers is a new form of sound money outside the control of any authority or government in the world. And this is something that is very, very important for the world economy, and I think it is going to have a very large impact on how the world economy functions in the future. And this is what my book begins to address. So the first point is explaining why I think Bitcoin is sound money. And that fundamentally has to do with the fact that Bitcoin is hard money as opposed to easy money. So easy money refers to money whose quantity is easy to increase in case there is an increase in demand for it. So if people move towards using copper as money, it is very easy for copper miners to produce very large quantities of copper that will increase the supply and bring the price back down, which will hurt the people who used copper as their store of value, because the value of copper will go down. So copper is bad as a store of value, therefore it is bad as money because it is easy to produce in response to an increase in demand. Therefore copper is easy money. Gold, on the other hand, is hard money because even if the price of gold goes up a lot, it is very hard for gold miners to increase the existing supplies of gold in the world significantly. And therefore, even if the price goes up because everybody's using gold as a store of value, it is hard to increase the supply, therefore it is hard to bring the value down. Therefore, gold serves as a good store of value in the long run. And time has shown that this is the case. It's served as much better store of value than other forms of money over time. So Bitcoin is far closer to gold. It is a digital equivalent of gold. Bitcoin is the digital version of gold, essentially. And people need to really understand that this is not an easy thing, and it's not a small claim, but they really need to understand why this is the case, why it functions that way. We need to get a little bit technical in the operation of Bitcoin, and the main idea is that Bitcoin's supply is strictly limited. There will only ever be 21 million Bitcoins, and the code that controls the issuing of the Bitcoins is decentralized amongst thousands, tens of thousands of nodes that operate the Bitcoin software. And if it were to change, it would need essentially the unanimous agreement of everybody involved. And since everybody involved has an interest in maintaining the monetary policy in a way that maintains the value of the money, it is highly unlikely that we're going to witness any change in the monetary policy. And if you've been following Bitcoin for the past few years, you'll see that even tiny technical changes like changing the block size or various parameters within Bitcoin, these sorts of changes have been almost impossible to make in Bitcoin. We need to start considering the fact that Bitcoin as it is going to survive. If you're going to try to change Bitcoin, what you'll end up with is another altcoin or another alternative coin. There are thousands of these. None of them matter, in my opinion, and we could get into that why in a bit. But essentially, it's possible to make a copy of Bitcoin, but it's not possible to change Bitcoin. There will always be some nodes that want to stick to the inflation schedule as it is, and there will always be some people who want to do that. And since that is the case, most likely everybody will want to stick with that. So therefore, I really think the monetary policy of Bitcoin, people need to start considering that it is immutable, that it isn't going to change. And since the supply is strictly limited, and since the network is distributed, nobody can control it, we might just have the digital equivalent of gold. And this, I think, is an enormously important innovation because it has many properties, and it has many good properties that gold doesn't have, which is that it's very easy to send across the world very quickly, and it's impossible to, well, not impossible, but it's much harder to confiscate it than gold. And therefore, the possibilities are very exciting for people who believe in the importance of sound money for society.
Very good, Saif. I'm just going to recap a bit for the audience. So basically, the important points are that the Bitcoin network is distributed, and I think what you point out nicely in your work is that there is an incentive structure of everybody involved. We won't get too much into the technicalities of mining, but the incentive structure is there to keep the protocol unchanged. And if you want to make changes like we had recently with the Bcash, Bitcoin Cash, you just fork off, and then the marketplace can decide whether they want that. But it seems that it gets like what 10% valuation of Bitcoin. So the initial protocol remains unchanged.
Precisely, and the point is that the real value of Bitcoin, and this is what I've been arguing for a while, the real value of Bitcoin is not in it's not in its operation, it's not in the payment network, it's not in fast or cheap payments or any of that. The real value is in the immutable monetary policy, and therefore any coin that will fork off Bitcoin, like Bitcoin Cash, starts off without the immaculate conception that Bitcoin has, therefore starts off as being something that is editable, and therefore starts off as being something whose monetary policy can be altered, and therefore it's never going to compete with Bitcoin. And this is really the point. If it was an issue about improving the payment speed or improving the payment transaction cost or any of that stuff, there will be many centralized alternatives that are better than Bitcoin. The issue is with Bitcoin, the reason we need the decentralization is that it prevents anybody from controlling the monetary policy and keeps the money predictable and hard. So therefore, any altcoin that forks off Bitcoin begins by taking away the predictability of the money supply, because it says, look, we are a bunch of people who can change the code of Bitcoin, and therefore I don't think any of these coins is ever going to have any traction. I mean, they'll go on the market, they'll help some people get rich by selling them off to people who don't really understand what is going on, but in time I think there's no chance that they will compete with the original implementation of Bitcoin, of the one whose money supply doesn't change.
Okay, so those are another two interesting points. First of all, you say Bitcoin doesn't even need to be that fast. It's more important to be able to occasionally, if necessary, transport large amounts of value, which the Bitcoin network can, but it's not important to compete with credit cards or
yes.
Whatever.
All payment solutions that we have existing over fiat money, over dollars and euros, they can easily be ported over to Bitcoin. There is no reason why credit cards and PayPal and all these new apps and innovations for payments across the world that are popping up everywhere, there's no reason why these can't be backed up with Bitcoin and people could use them. And the level of security of Bitcoin is frankly unnecessary for your daily purchases. When you buy your coffee or you buy your lunch, you don't need the level of security that Bitcoin provides. It's sort of it's really overkill, and you don't need to pay for it. Where Bitcoin matters is for the selling, is for the moving of very large quantities and high amounts of value, particularly in transactions where you're trying to avoid censorship, political censorship, or economic inflation from central banks. So as a store of value, this is what Bitcoin's importance is. The issues of payments and cheap payments can all be ported over sound money later on. However, if we try to compromise Bitcoin's sound money by altering something about its structure in order to make the payments faster, that will quickly devalue the proposition of the monetary supply, of the money supply being immutable, of the monetary policy being immutable, and will therefore devalue the only value proposition of Bitcoin in my mind. And in this case, it wouldn't even matter if Bitcoin was fast or efficient, because there are many, many, many fast and efficient and cheap centralized payments. And in my opinion, there's no way that a decentralized network will be more efficient in processing transactions than a centralized network, because a centralized network needs one record of transaction and a few backups. A decentralized network has to record it over thousands and tens of thousands of nodes. So we'll naturally have to expend much more processing power, and we'll need much more time to sync all of the ledgers together, as we see with Bitcoin. So Bitcoin transactions are not as fast as, say, your PayPal transaction or your credit card transaction on chain, but that is fine. I think in the future, in my opinion, Bitcoin is going to move more and more towards being a settlement and clearance currency. Daily transactions can be done in Bitcoin using all sorts of digital and physical instruments and credit cards and their like. But the final clearance will happen in Bitcoin. And this is really where the real advantage of Bitcoin is. You don't want to compare Bitcoin to your credit card for your coffee. This is a little bit like using a Concorde jet plane to drive down an avenue in a city. It's a completely useless use of a very powerful tool. Where Bitcoin is really powerful is if you want to compare its transactions with interbank settlements, with central bank settlements, with trying to move actual physical gold from one place to the other. These things are very expensive. They involve a lot of security risk, and they involve the risk of being confiscated by government authorities. And yet Bitcoin can go around all of these risks. You can send $100 million in Bitcoin across the world and it'll confirm in 30, 40 minutes, and currently the transaction fee is $2, $3. So 30, 40 minutes and $2, $3 transaction fee, or $1 transaction fee, does not compete with the credit card payment for your coffee. It doesn't need to. It competes with your central bank's clearance payment to another central bank or settlement between large banks with one another. In that case, $2, $3, even $200 or $300 or $2,000 transaction fee is a very small price to pay, and 40 minutes is a very small amount of time for such a massively important transaction.
And as you said, as you pointed out, that would then be a scenario where Bitcoin is like the gold of 120 years ago, when the gold was never moving. It was sitting in bank vaults, it was sitting in central bank vaults.
Yeah.
And they did all the transactions, and then some of it was used to send around to settle those transactions. And still, the money system at that time was very stable and had very low inflation and had very good good economic properties.
Precisely. Right? I mean, the gold, under the gold standard, it's not that it never moved, it did move, but the vast majority of transactions didn't involve having to physically move gold around. And physically moving gold around is much more expensive than moving Bitcoins around. And so, we can have hundreds and thousands of transactions take place for every one transaction in which actual physical gold moves. So actual Bitcoin moves on chain. So we can have all these second layer solutions for scaling the number of transactions of Bitcoin that are that only settle finally off chain. And I think this is not really. This is not a bad thing, because the real importance of Bitcoin, as I said, is in the monetary policy, is its availability as a sound money, as a store of value. Yeah.
So also as a last recourse, like if you have gold in the bank, ideally you don't want to use it because the bank will have a decent credit policy and it will administer it properly. But if there's something wrong, you can withdraw it and you can put it in your house and you can say, hey, I have it. And that's the same with Bitcoin. In the worst case scenario, you still own the money, you still control the money, you can still use the money. You don't want to do it, but if worst comes to worst, you can.
Exactly. And the fundamental difference with gold is that the number of transactions that can be done in Bitcoin, even if we assume that the Bitcoin network is not going to have any more efficiency improvements as it is, it can do about 400,000 transactions a day. And these can be completed and final and confirmed within 30, 40 minutes. So that's an enormous amount of base money transactions, and that's far more than the base money transactions and settlements that needed to be done between banks under a gold standard. And it's much more than the base money transactions of settlement that are done between central banks today. So if you look at the era of the gold standard, the classic gold standard from 1870, from the end of the Franco-Prussian War until the beginning of the World War I, I mean, there's a reason this is known as the golden era, the gilded age, la belle époque. It was a time of unrivaled human flourishing all over the world. Economic growth everywhere, technology was being spread all over the world. Peace and prosperity were increasing everywhere around the world. Technological innovations were impressively advancing. All of the most important innovations that we have in our world today really came from that period. You know, you think of the car, the airplane, the much of our telecommunication infrastructure, all of it came in that period. It really is astounding when you think about all of the things that happened under the era of the gold standard, and I think this is no coincidence. What the gold standard allowed people to do is to have a store of value that will maintain its value into the future, and that that gives people a low time preference. That gives people the incentive to think of the long term, and it makes people want to invest in things that will pay off over the long term. On the other hand, when you have money which is not sound, when you have easy money whose value continuously is eroding because it's very easy for others to create and increase its supply, you have the opposite process, which is what we see in the 20th century. People's time preferences rise, people start focusing more on the short term and start being less able to focus on the long term. And you can see the cultural and sociological and political effects of that by comparing the 19th and 20th centuries in many ways. And it's a long discussion which I get into in my book as well.
But basically, those are the two antagonists. On the one hand, the Austrian School of Economics, which says savings are good. Why? Because they enable investments, so gains in productivity. So you have to, in one period you have less, but then 10 periods later you have a lot more, and you can produce it cheaper by using fewer resources. Whereas the Keynesian school says, no, you have to consume everything now because we need aggregate demand. And that comes with this whole inflation policy, and then you consume everything today, but you don't invest, and then 10 periods later, you don't have everything left.
Absolutely. I mean, Keynes is the poster child of high time preference, short-sightedness, and inability to think into the future. And it's really ridiculous that his nonsense is taught in universities today, and I'm guilty of teaching it myself to my students, but at least I tell them. It's really ridiculous that the garbage that he wrote is taught in universities. His idea of spending being necessary for the economy completely is a sign of somebody who has absolutely no idea of how an economic system functions. The only way that you can spend is after you've produced, and the only way that anybody can buy anything is if other people have produced it. And if everybody starts spending everything, there will be no capital accumulation. Without capital accumulation, without more capital, production declines, and then the stock of capital begins to decline and the productivity declines, and so people's wages and incomes will decline. The process of civilization, the process of human civilization, of moving away from being monkeys throwing our dirt at each other towards becoming civilized human beings as we are today, is the process of capital accumulation. It's what differentiates us between monkeys, that we think about the future, we build tools, we own the tools, we invest in them, in making them better. We develop the ability to work for the future and not for the immediate gratification, and that's different. That differentiates us from animals, in that, and from Keynes, essentially, in that you're capable of thinking about planning for the future. So you invest your time not in something that will reward you now, but you invest your time in something that will increase your ability to produce now, so that in the future you can benefit from more production. So we increase the capital stock. We move from, say, catching fish with our own hands to catching fish with a fishing rod to catching fish with a fishing boat, then a bigger fishing boat and a net, and then today we have these massive, highly productive, extremely sophisticated and complex ships and large trawlers that catch enormous amounts of fish. The productivity of an hour of labor, as we accumulate more capital, continues to rise. And so only because people have delayed consumption, only because people delay their gratification, only because the fisherman decides they're not going to spend some time today catching fish, instead they're going to spend that time building the boat, do we get capital accumulation. Only because of that does productivity increase, and only because of that does income increase. So in the long run, you have to have a low time preference in order to accumulate capital, in order to increase the productivity, in order to have the process of civilization advance, and in order for human life to increase and for people to be able to meet their economic needs easily. As an economy advances, this is the process that happens. The opposite of that process, the process of decivilization, is what happens when people like Keynes influence economic policy, which drives governments to drive their citizens towards we need to spend now, you need to save less. And so if you look at the 20th century, you see in the Western economies, the saving rates have been declining as people get into more and more and more debt. And we have now the idea of people getting into debt for consumption. People don't get into debt just for investment anymore. They get into debt for consumption, to finance their consumption. So capital accumulation is essentially being reversed, regardless of what the numbers of the money show, because that money is something that's very easy to produce. What is really happening in terms of the physical capital stock is that the growth in the physical capital stock is declining. The amount of savings that people have, the amount of capital that individuals have, is declining because more and more people are getting into debt. And that's the result of 80 years of activist government policy, trying to force people towards higher levels of spending and less saving and less investment. And it's essentially the opposite of the process of civilization. It's the process of de-civilization.
And you make the main point that Bitcoin could turn this whole thing around. How would we get there?
Well, I mean, Bitcoin is already turning this thing around because essentially it is already the national currency of the internet, if you want. It's already a currency of a new economy, and anybody who wants can join that currency, regardless of what their government's monetary policy is. So it's as if we have a new country with a new central bank and a new monetary policy, and it's open to anybody in the world to join it and to begin to use a store of value that is not easy money, that is hard money, that is meant to appreciate. And once you've made that move, you know, I know a lot of people individually who have witnessed this change in their own attitude. Once you've started holding some Bitcoin and you see it appreciate, you start understanding that there is a very high opportunity cost to spending, and you start thinking of frivolous spending twice. And you start thinking of saving more and more and more because you understand that saving will appreciate over time. And so you see this change in many Bitcoiners, that they used to be more of a high time preference, high spending people who would just get their paycheck and spend it like most people do today. But once they start moving into Bitcoin, they understand, and the reason they do that is because if you're spending, you know, if you're earning your money in dollars and then if you save it in dollars, it's likely to lose its value over time. It won't appreciate. And then if you put it in investments, there are always risks involved. And so generally, the declining value of money is going to likely lead you to spend more and more and more. But you see it as they switch towards Bitcoin, we get that opposite effect. And I think this might be the most important thing that Bitcoin does in terms of its effect on on people's time preference and people's long-term horizon.
So instead of a government program, you have individuals seeing the difference, feeling the difference, and basically changing their incentives because Bitcoin has the right properties.
Yes, it's an astonishing achievement. The invention of Bitcoin is really something that blows my mind every day, that this thing succeeded, it works, and it's been working almost flawlessly since its inception. And more people need to come to terms with the fact that this is not a gadget that can be closed down. This is technological innovation. And you know, when people think about, well, if Bitcoin gets too big, the government is going to ban it, that's complete nonsense. It's fiction. It's a little bit like saying the government was going to ban wheels or the government is going to ban the internet. These things don't really work that way. Bitcoin and the internet are protocols. They are ideas. Any two computers in the world, if they use the same protocol, they can connect to one another and you have an internet. And same is true for Bitcoin. So it's not something that's going to go away, and people need to start thinking more seriously about its implications.
Talking about closing Bitcoin down, recently we had a lot of big trouble in Little China. Mm-hmm. Where China basically they put their foot down and the exchanges are now closing down. Mm-hmm. I've heard rumors that they want to ban mining or confiscate the miners, maybe even ban Bitcoin. What do you think about these developments?
To be honest, I don't really have any special insight beyond what you and I can read on the newspaper, so I don't really know exactly what is going to happen. I have no insider sources or anything. However, whether they banning the exchanges is one thing. Banning Bitcoin is something completely different. You can close the exchanges. The exchanges have physical locations, and they have people who run them, and you can arrest them, and you can put them in jail. You can close down the exchanges. That's not a problem. But you know, the exchange transactions are not Bitcoin transactions. They're all off-chain. So closing down all the Bitcoin exchanges in the world does not even show up on the Bitcoin blockchain. The transactions on Bitcoin continue to be done. Obviously, it'll inconvenience people a lot, but I don't really see it as being effective in stemming the tide of people who are becoming more and more interested in Bitcoin because of its properties as a sound money. So I highly doubt that closing the exchanges is going to be a big blow to Bitcoin. I don't think it's going to matter in the long run. Initially, when this news is announced, you get a relatively big crash in the price, but then the price is more or less recovered. Even if the price stagnates for a year or two, this is something that many Bitcoiners are very much capable of handling. It's not a big issue. In terms of whether China can ban Bitcoin completely or whether China will try to ban Bitcoin completely, I highly doubt it, because if they try to think about it logistically, it's a fool's errand to try to ban something that you cannot control. It's not something that they can actually ban for various technical reasons. People in China will still be able to connect to the Bitcoin network in many different ways. Whether they clamp down on miners and start imposing more draconian measures preventing people from using Bitcoin or mining Bitcoin or not, I think is more of an issue for China and for Chinese people, not for Bitcoin, and not so much for Bitcoiners. So the if they ban mining in China, the mining equipment will just leave China and go elsewhere where people will use it to continue mining. Even if they confiscate the miners, they will only lead to a temporary reduction in the hash power, but then the hash power will continue to grow and the network will continue to grow. So, on the contrary, in fact, as Nassim Taleb said, what Bitcoin really needs in order to continue to prosper and grow is for a government to try and ban it. Because once they do that, that will, first of all, demonstrate the real use case of Bitcoin, which is that if your government is capable of if your government is the sort of government that will ban Bitcoin, then you definitely need to get your hands on some Bitcoin. And secondly, it'll turn people's eyes towards thinking of this and thinking, oh, wow, this is more than just a silly internet gimmick. This is something that has our government banning it. People are going to pay much more attention. So in the long run, whatever governments try and impose in terms of restrictions against Bitcoin, I think will play into the hands of Bitcoin. It's just the nature of being better money means that whichever way the wind blows, Bitcoin comes out on top, essentially. And this is how we've seen the operation of Bitcoin over the last 8-9 years continue to grow. So many things that people predicted would kill Bitcoin or would weaken it. So many things that skeptics said would happen that would destroy Bitcoin's value proposition. They have happened, and instead Bitcoin has gotten stronger. And there are numerous examples of this. So whatever China does, I think, will matter to Chinese people, and the Chinese government is certainly capable of imposing draconian and restrictive measures on its people in terms of Bitcoin. However, in the long run, I think they won't do that. And if they did, it won't matter to Bitcoin. But I really don't think they will do that, because China will start thinking strategically about this reserve asset, about Bitcoin as a reserve asset, because China's problem with the large amount of dollar reserves that it has, because of its reliance on the dollar and international settlement in international central bank settlement in dollars, is something that China has expressed misgivings about over the last decade or two. And they make noises about shifting towards gold, or about making some trades denominated in gold, or about setting up an alternative banking system denominated in the yuan, or with the Russians and with other countries denominated in other currencies. This is where Bitcoin's importance lies. And I would bet that the noise about banning it and the noise about ending it is more of a prelude towards more official adoption of it and control of it. This is what we're more likely to see. So I wouldn't be surprised if the government would confiscate all the Bitcoin miners, if the government would set up a nationalized exchange where people can only buy and sell Bitcoin from the government, and as an attempt to build up a Chinese central bank reserves in Bitcoin as a hedge against the dollar and as a future possibility towards using Bitcoin for final settlement.
That's a fascinating theory, and in fact, it doesn't even sound so far-fetched if you look at what the Chinese are doing with gold. They have all the gold mines nationalized, so they could nationalize the Bitcoin mines.
Mm-hmm.
They're buying as much physical as they can to hedge against the dollar, so they could get their hands on Bitcoin to hedge against the dollar, as you say. And interestingly enough, they do allow Chinese people to get gold legally, but through the banking system, which is mostly state-controlled. So you could have a nationalized state-controlled exchange. And then the Chinese, in fact, instead of making steps backward, although they are communists and control freaks, in terms of competing against governments, they would be one step ahead.
Precisely. And I think, calling yourself a communist is one thing, but the Chinese have lived through communism and they realize what exactly it means. And I think they're probably less likely to undertake these sort of draconian measures because they've come to really appreciate the importance of free enterprise. And I think it's far more likely the government will try and co-opt the system to try and improve its own position and increase its reserves, as you mentioned in the case of gold. Yeah.
Fantastic. So those were some very fascinating thoughts, some extremely interesting topics from Saifedean Ammous. Follow him on Twitter, and also please check out his book, The Bitcoin Standard. It's coming out in December, published by Wiley & Sons. I highly recommend it. Saifedean, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Valentin. It's been a pleasure.